this first meeting of the Cabinet Committee Local Plan on Thursday, the 10th of August 2023, from the Wharton Suite in Winchester Guildhall. The time is just after 10 a.m. My name is Councillor Jackie Porter. I'm Chairperson and Cabinet Member for Place and the Local Plan. This meeting is live streamed from the Council's YouTube channel, and the recording will be available after the meeting. Subtitles can be switched on, and advice how to turn these on is on our website. Can everyone ensure mobile phones are switched off, please, and other devices are on silent? And can I remind members to use their microphones so that the recordings and the visitors, so that the recordings can be heard by everybody online as well. In the unlikely event that there is a need to evacuate the building because of fire, the fire alarm will sound, and please follow all instructions given to you by our team that are here today. And I welcome members of the public as well to this meeting this morning, and we'll invite you forward when it's time for you to make your contribution. I'd also like to mention Councillor Cutler is in the audience. He's the Deputy Leader and is available to answer questions should we need to. So thank you, Councillor Cutler. So this is the first meeting of this Cabinet Committee, and I'd just like to remind you that the terms of reference are set out clearly in the agenda and online. And I'd like to welcome my fellow councillors from across the council. Thank you very much for coming. And two fellow voting members of Cabinet, Councillors Thompson and Westwood. And we have apologies, which I'll describe later in a moment. But also here with us today are our officers. And I'd just like you to introduce yourselves and your roles, if you could. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dawn Adey. I'm strategic. Hello, I'm Sharon Evans, Strategic Director and the Council's Monitoring Officer.
Good morning, I'm Julie Pinnock. I'm the Service Lead for Built Environment.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Evans. I'm the Interim Corporate Head for Planning and Regulatory Services.
Hello, I'm Toby Ayling. I'm Principal Planning Officer in the Strategic Policy team.
Morning, everybody. Adrian Fox, the Strategic Planning Manager.
Thank you very much. So now we'll turn to the agenda. Are there any apologies?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence received from Councillors Todd and Lerny, with Councillors Westwood and Thompson deputising. Thank you.
Thank you. So today, are there any declarations of interest, please? I have to make one. I have a personal non-prejudicial interest as a county councillor. Does anybody else have any prejudicial or personal issues? Councillor Lamy.
I'm Ward Councillor for Battery and Badger Farm and also Chairman of the Local Residents Association and Community Sector.
Thank you. So today the main item is the local development scheme, and the following people have requested to speak to this item. Patrick Davis, Councillor Carkeet on behalf of Curdridge and Curdbridge Parish Council, Mr Morse and Mr Fickling. And we have some observers too, so welcome to them. I intend to offer Mr Fox the opportunity to make the presentation, which is on page 47 in the papers, but hopefully that will answer any questions you have before you make your presentations from the public. But we'll then proceed with the public and councillor representations. But Mr Davis has asked to speak early as he has another meeting, so in this case I will indicate a suitable time for Mr Davis to speak. Questions from the committee will then be heard following Mr Fox's presentation, followed by debate. So it's very clear that the purpose of today's meeting is to consider the report to seek approval for a revised local development scheme, after having considered the factors that have resulted in the need to revise the LDS set out in 2021. And for clarity for observers and for participants, the revised local development scheme starts on page 27 of the pack and includes appendices A and B. And so just before we start, I've got a couple of announcements. Mrs Adey, you wanted to make a comment.
Thank you, Chair. Paragraph 10.31 of this report discusses a delay due to a commission from Hampshire County Council's trading arm. Hampshire have written to us to express concern about this paragraph. I'd just like to assure all of the Cabinet around the table today that Hampshire continue to be good partners for Winchester City Council. Hampshire have written to us on behalf of their trading company, and their letter confirms the following. While we appreciate that Winchester City Council officers are keen to tie down the timescales for the project, we've always been upfront that there are a number of variables outside of our control that impact on the time taken to undertake the work. This includes current baselining work on the model and the as yet unknown number of sites and transport interventions. And we're happy to make this clarification. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And also, I think councillors will have received a letter from Lichfields. I think all of us have received that. Just to say, unfortunately, they didn't take the opportunity to speak at the meeting, so we will be responding to their letter separately. Thank you. Mr. Davis, would you like to come forward and make your presentation? No, because they didn't choose to make it public.
Did I clarify there, Chair? It wasn't received in time for us to publish with the papers, so it's not valid.
You hear that?
Of course, it wasn't received by the time we published the papers for the meeting, and clearly we've got to publish any papers for this meeting at the statute time. I'm looking to the monitoring officer for clarification.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We didn't get the representation or the correspondence until after our deadline had closed. So we've been unable to publish that at this moment in time. And as the chair has said, it will be dealt with separately from this meeting.
I've been advised that it's not because they don't have the right to speak and they published it post, or they sent it post the deadline, then it's not part of the papers here today. Councillor Davis, would you like to come and make your presentation or representation?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm grateful for being able to say something at the beginning, and I will catch up with the meeting with the wonders of modern technology later on. What I wanted to raise was and I commend the officers, Mr. Fox and his colleagues, for the amount of work they put into this exercise. And I don't in any way want to undermine that, but I'm slightly horrified with Councillor Horrell's latest outburst, but no doubt you'll be dealing with that later. What I'm concerned about is the various references in the papers in front of you to the meetings which took place with the PINS advisory people and the representatives of the government department on the 15th of June. Because since then, of course, Parliament, or at least the Commons, went on its long holiday on the 20th of July. On Monday, the 24th, the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, made a speech and released a whole set of variations on existing consultations and new ones. And I now have grave doubts about what the implications of those pronouncements from Gove make to your processes. I think it's extremely unfortunate it was done on that day deliberately, so it could not be questioned in the Commons. What he hadn't quite worked out, that the Lords were still sitting, and there was an urgent question in the Lords on that day, and further contribution the following day by your party's spokesman on local government in the Lords. And she seemed to, and she's from Somerset, she seemed to conclude that the result of what Gove was saying is there will be no significant development anywhere except these 20 big cities that Gove went on about. The only other thing he said, which is remotely local but interesting, is he commended the Wellbourne proposed development in Fareham, as he did in a couple of newspaper articles, as if it already happened, which is astonishing to me. It seemed so out of touch. But really the point I'm making is that I don't see how you can proceed on the basis of what happened on the 15th of June without checking that the latest pronouncements from Gove haven't in fact wrecked what you were told at that time. And it seems to me particularly unfortunate, the timing of this, because the government are playing silly games with this. And we don't even know the bill, which is still trundling its way through Parliament, and is now going to have to, and in the Lords, questions were raised by ex-ministers from his own side about what it now meant for the progress on that bill, because huge more chunks of amendments are going to be necessary. And when will it come into effect? All these questions, in my view, need to be answered, and they haven't been answered. I ask you to look at this and try and answer these points. Thank you.
I can assure you that those questions will be raised during the debate. I'm sorry that you won't be here to hear it, but I do ask you to listen online.
Yes.
And we can have other conversations in the future if you wish to, by making another representation. Certainly, there's one very clear lesson that has come from many of the planning meetings that we go to and the webinars we go to, that until it's law, it isn't real.
Thank you. I can stay for myself for now.
Mr. Fox, would you like to make a presentation? Thank you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chair. Right. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to talk you through a presentation that's been prepared, and obviously it's available as part of the agenda pack. It is going to be a fairly long presentation, so please bear with me. But it's long because obviously it's complicated. And I will start by saying that obviously to revise the local development scheme is a decision that's not been taken lightly by us as obviously officers and working obviously with members about obviously a realistic timetable to bring the local plan forward. So let's just make sure that we I will understand what the local development scheme is. It's obviously a really important document because it sets out the timetable for the production of the local plan. And it's obviously a useful tool because obviously it takes forward obviously the council priorities in the form of the local plan. It's good practice to obviously review the local plan timetable at certain key stages is what we've done. And if circumstances or the national or local level are set out of our control happen. Key thing is it must be publicly available on the council's website. So the last LDS that we approved at Cabinet was approved in July 2021. And obviously we've completed a major milestone by obviously producing and consulting on the Reg 18 local plan, which I'll come on to a bit further. But obviously for those of you not familiar with the process, we obviously have to analyse any comments that we've received, then move towards what's called the Reg 19 stage and public that for public consultation, exactly the same way that we did the Reg 18 consultation in terms of engaging with obviously the local community, town and parish councils, doing all the social media that we did, events, etc. And then obviously, but the key thing is the Reg 19 local plan is the version of the local plan that you want examined, i.e. the council wants examined. And that's really important message that I'm going to keep coming back to in my presentation. So in other words, the Reg 19 plan is the plan that you want examined. So therefore, all the necessary evidence base has got to be completed for you to progress safely to that stage to produce a safe local plan. We then obviously analyse any reps, and at the Reg 19 stage, we are looking for what I could call kind of complete showstoppers, i.e. has anything come up in the Reg 19 plan that would undermine or derail obviously the strategy that we want examined. We then obviously proceed to a local plan examination. An independent inspector will be appointed to conduct that examination. And as part of that examination process, there may or may not be the need to obviously identify proposed main modifications. Now, they can't go to the heart of the local plan, but they can certainly address changes to the policy and maybe changes to the site allocations if the inspector feels that obviously we aren't able to demonstrate that some sites are deliverable. And then obviously we progress to the inspector's report and to adopt the local plan. Now, along that kind of journey, that timeline, there are key stages and key checks and challenges that obviously we have to ensure that we meet professionally. So just to reiterate, obviously the Reg 19 plan is the version of the plan that we obviously want examined, and the evidence base needs to be robust. If we don't have a up-to-date LDS, it can be an issue raised at examination. I'm certainly aware of that situation from my days in Kent when BASIC was raised on first day one, is your plan in accordance with the LDS? And a neighbouring authority couldn't demonstrate that. The current local plan covers the period 2019 to 2039, and obviously it adopts as per that timetable, adopts the plan in August 2024. Now, the end date of the local plan is really important because what we need to ensure is at the time of adoption, we've got a local plan that covers a minimum of 15 years from the date of adoption. So what goes into producing a sound local plan? Well, clearly at the moment, there's been numerous government consultations, and the speaker alluded to some of those recently. Now, obviously, our team has responded to a number of those ones, particularly the first four, in terms of obviously what's going to happen. The latest information we have is that there will be some changes to the NPPF in the autumn, according to the government, whether or not that's September, October, November, not too sure. And there will be further changes next year with the NPPF. So clearly we're trying to produce this local plan when obviously the world around us is changing. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we're future-proofing the plan and we're aware of what's happening on the horizon. So, for example, for the free consultations that are listed in that presentation, we've attended various webinars and we're going to an event in London to find out some more about obviously the proposed planning reforms. Now, they are only proposals and they're subject to consultation, so we don't yet know whether or not they will actually happen. And obviously the government is consulting on permitted development rights, and that has implications for the local plan in terms of particularly agricultural dwellings and things like that, in terms of obviously how we craft those policies, and operational reforms to the national significant infrastructure projects. Now, obviously, these all take time for us to respond to, and obviously I'll come on to that in terms of obviously where we need to focus our efforts moving forward. But obviously, clearly, we need to keep abreast of what's actually happening on the horizon. So we did obviously achieve a major milestone. We did achieve obviously the local plan regulation 18 consultation, November, December 2022. And the good news was obviously our methods of engaging with people and engaging with obviously the members of the public, local parish councils, town councils and people was commended obviously part of the strategic issues and options priorities. And the RTBI said that obviously it went above and beyond what was expected. And we've rolled that forward to the Reg 18 local plan, and we're certainly obviously learning each time we do consultations about how can we engage, how can we listen to people better. And that paid great dividends because obviously we had high levels of feedback that we received, and we received over 3,500 comments back on the Reg 18 local plan. But obviously there are actually significantly more comments than that because people have made numerous comments under one single representation, and that is taking time to work through because clearly we need to understand, is it a good point that somebody's made? Do we need to talk to our colleagues in other members of the teams in the council? And more importantly, is it a change that we think could be supported and make the plan better? And that all takes time. We also had a number of in-depth technical responses, particularly to our climate emergency policies that need very detailed consideration. And as I emphasise, this is a council-wide local plan. So we're working across a number of different teams across the whole of the council, and we need their input and their advice to obviously shape and develop the Reg 19 local plan. So in terms of what my team are actually working on, we're obviously undertaking our analysis of the representations, and they will be reported back to full council as part of the Reg 19 local plan. We're also identifying what new areas of evidence space needs to be commissioned, because clearly some of the representations, and I'll come on to that in a minute, have identified that we should do some further work on a number of issues. We've had a number of initial meetings with our statutory agencies just to make sure that we're very clear about what their representation is asking and how we can address it. And we've also identified a number of issues, and we will be starting very shortly after the summer break on Statement of Common Grounds. I think there's around about 12 to 15 Statement of Common Grounds that we need to agree with statutory agencies and neighbouring authorities, and that's in addition to the work that we're doing with PUSH. And obviously we're working on a number of technical work streams which are outlined in this slide. So we did manage to go to Cabinet on the 18th of July with an updated Sheila. So that basically is new sites that were put forward. We're also working on what's called site deliverability statements. Those statements are really important and will be a critical part of the local plan examination process. They cover basically what we're doing is we're contacting anybody who's put a site forward in the Reg 18 local plan, i.e. an allocated site, and we're asking them very challenging and testing questions about how deliverable their site is, because deliverability will be a key test at the local plan examination. So in other words, are there restricted covenants? Is there anything on the site that will preclude development coming forward? And what is their thoughts on timing? And most importantly, how is the site promoter developer going to tackle nutrients? And they are key pieces of work that obviously will be available when we go to the local plan examination. We're finalising the strategic flood risk assessment. We've worked with our partners in Push to do that. Acorn are doing the work, and that's nearing completion. And basically, we need to make sure we take into account the findings of that report. The Environment Agency have raised some comments, which we're talking to them about the site sequential test of site allocation. So we're working closely with the Environment Agency about how we can address those issues. We're preparing an infrastructure delivery plan. Infrastructure often comes up in discussions with the local community that it's really important to obviously view what infrastructure is actually needed to support obviously the delivery of the local plan. And that information will be available at the Reg 19 stage. We're looking at the need for student accommodation. The university has made some representations about our evidence base. So we are obviously working with the universities to make sure we've got up-to-date information on student accommodation. We're updating the statement of community involvement. I'll come on to that in a separate slide. And that's really important, obviously, because that's the document about how we're going to consult with people, and more importantly, how we're going to listen to their feedback and involve us in terms of preparing the local plan, but also obviously development management applications. Nutrient neutrality report. I'll come on to a separate slide on nutrients, but obviously it's essential as part of the local plan that obviously we have a solution to nutrients, and obviously we set out clearly what we're doing in relation to that, and that will be a key thing in respect to what we're looking at. We need to test and review the development strategy, because this is an iterative process in terms of obviously preparing a local plan, in terms of looking at the evidence space, looking at the representations and telling you what to mean. We're doing some work with Itrobo on an embodied carbon report. A number of the representations have raised the issue of embodied carbon. That is a very challenging area because there is actually no consistent government guidance in terms of how you actually deal with that. For those people who are familiar with that term, you're looking at obviously not only embodied carbon, but obviously operational carbon. And the way I describe it is from cradle to grave. And we're trying to work out how we can address that in the plan. Can we have a policy on embodied carbon in the local plan, and how far can that policy go? We'll be producing a series of topic papers on key issues. Now, the topic papers are really important, and I'll come on to those in a minute, because obviously they can really help you out in examination, because you clearly document the process that you've been to get obviously to a solution or an answer, and that can help us out at the local plan examination. As I mentioned, we will be preparing the statement of common grounds and enter into discussions with our neighbours and statutory agencies about the content of those. And alongside, obviously, the local plan, we need to update the local plan viability assessment, and that needs to be published at the Reg 19 stage. So in other words, any policy that has a financial impact on the plan needs to be assessed. So that's anything from affordable housing to obviously higher energy performance standards. And we need to rerun everything again through the integrated impact assessment, i.e. the sustainability appraisal and the habitat regulations assessment. And only by doing this in a very logical and sequential way can we produce obviously a sound local plan. So what factors have resulted in the need to change the timetable? Well, the key issue is nutrients. Now, just so that everybody is very clear about what that involves, it's a very big issue that obviously affects obviously nature. So basically, in terms of obviously, if you increase nitrogen and phosphates, it can speed up growth of certain plants and impact on wildlife. There is a link in this presentation by Plan Oaks, Zach, who's a very well-known barrister, so I'd encourage you to click on that link. Now, previously there were 32 authorities that were in unfavourable conditions. However, in March last year, it was sprung on us without any notice that obviously our area was covered by not only nitrates, but obviously phosphorus. Now, we as a competent authority need to be satisfied under the habitat regulations that we obviously, how we address that. Now, in terms of obviously how does nutrients obviously affect, So it comes from agricultural activity, waste from fertiliser, animal slurry. It also comes from obviously the use and occupancy of homes, and it comes from surface water runoff. And it's a really important issue that obviously we need to address. And we're not alone in this. There's 26 authorities that are covered by nitrates and phosphorus problem. And obviously the situation in Winchester is complicated because we actually have 3 river catchment areas. So they're identified on the plan. So obviously we need to think about how they affect. Now, obviously rivers do not stop at geographical boundaries, obviously administration boundaries. They flow through obviously different areas. And that's why it's really important, obviously, we work with our partners in Push to obviously find solutions. As I mentioned, we are asking the site promoters in the Reg 18 local plan to obviously complete site deliverability statements about how they intend to address nutrients. Partnership for South Hampshire are obviously the lead agency working on behalf of us, and they are, I think, one of the experts in this area. We're very fortunate to have obviously a very excellent team at Push working on our behalf. We did submit a number of funding bids to improve obviously our Winchester wastewater treatment facilities. A number of the wastewater treatment facilities are in the ownership of Winchester City Council, and they were agreed by Push and they were submitted to government. But government funding has not yet been released for those. We understand they're still assessing those bids. Now, despite obviously effort and time that we've spent obviously as officers and working with Push, it's still an extremely challenging situation, and it needs obviously key wider joint solutions, as many organisations are involved in this, not only the water companies, not only ourselves, not only the developers, but everybody's trying to find a joint solution to tackle this. And different authorities are obviously affected in different ways. Obviously, as I mentioned, we've got the double issue of obviously nitrates and phosphorus. One key area of work that we are updating is that we want to make sure that we support obviously the high street and the local economy. Obviously, COVID had a devastating effect in terms of obviously the high street, in terms of a number of large multiples, obviously, unfortunately, went under, such as Debenhams and people like that. And we're very keen to make sure that obviously the retail and employment studies are updated and refreshed, because they were both completed just at the outbreak of COVID-19. And obviously the impact obviously of the high streets and the economic ramifications are obviously far reached than obviously what we thought was at the beginning. Clearly, obviously, since that time, a number of high street stores have gone into administration. The use and growth of the internet has obviously expanded a lot quicker than obviously anybody first imagined. So what we did was we sought the advice and support of the Planning Advisory Service, and they provided us with an inspector that helped us draft the technical brief for that study in the autumn 2022. We then went out to tender and appointed a company to undertake that work. But obviously, clearly, because obviously this area of work is in high demand, the consultants are obviously in high demand. And we're hoping to have a stakeholder workshop in October to discuss the initial findings of this work. And I've got Toby Ayling sitting next to me, who's been leading on that particular work stream. A very important part of preparing a sound local plan is to look at transport implications. The Hampshire County Council have got what's called a trading arm set up to obviously deal with this. We went to Hampshire County Council because they'd successfully gone through the local plan examination with our colleagues at Fareham. But obviously, clearly, the model needs to be recalibrated to take account of obviously new trends and travel trends since the pandemic. And clearly, obviously, the transport model that we have in operation, which is operated by Sistra, not many people were using it during obviously COVID, so it needs to be updated with obviously new traffic flows. But unfortunately, obviously, the timetable supplied by Hampshire did take longer than what was originally envisaged, and the costs were significantly higher. But we feel that the best place to deal with obviously the strategic transport assessment. So in terms of what that's actually going to do, we first of all have to do what's called a baseline transport model run. So in other words, what's happening to the traffic network at the moment, i.e. with no site allocations and the baseline position. So once you've got that calibrated, you can then do what's called a do minimum transport run. So in other words, you put in the site allocations that you want to allocate with no mitigation. You then run a third model, which is a do something transport run. So in other words, that's the site allocations and what mitigation you need to obviously mitigate against obviously the impact of that. And I'll come on to how that can be dealt with. So it's an extremely important and piece of work that obviously the evidence base needs to be obviously correct, because often it's raised by local people and organisations as a key area of concern. You're planning all this housing, what's happening to the local highway network. But what is really, really important is that it not only covers obviously roads in terms of obviously the drivers and cars, etc., but we want to make sure there's a very clear focus on sustainable transport methods of transport. So that's by cycling, walking, and obviously we want to make sure that they're at the forefront of our thought process. Importantly, we need to think about the results of the transport assessment from a nature conservation perspective. Again, with the habitat regulations assessment, we need to think about obviously the impact of increasing car movement in terms of obviously European sites. And if necessary, we need to do air quality work to back that up. And obviously, importantly, we need to think about the cumulative effect of obviously what's going to happen when obviously we plan this development, and obviously think about the costs of that in terms of the local plan viability assessment, i.e. what is the cost of doing that mitigation? What is the cost of putting that cycle lane in? What is the cost of doing that? As I mentioned, a key area of work stream that we're looking at is updating the statement of community involvement. Now, key part of that is that we are committed to listening to our local community and making sure when we do get comments, obviously we take those seriously, and obviously we think about obviously how we can obviously strengthen the local plan and build on the back of obviously what the RTPI said. So it's essential that obviously we look at obviously the SCI, which was adopted in 2018. The world has obviously changed since then in terms of obviously electronic communications, the way we can do it. We obviously in the SIP consultation ran a number of interactive events, and those events wouldn't have happened, say, in 2018. And that's becoming more and more the norm about how can we reach the widest possible people? How can we reach that and target that younger audience, the people that obviously we want to obviously really target, because they often come in a hard to reach group. And obviously the SCI, it's really important that obviously we update it to make sure we've got the widest possible audience for obviously the Reg 19 consultation. So what we're intending to do is come to a decision date on the 9th of October with a revised SCI that will go out for 6 weeks public consultation, and that will come back to Cabinet probably in January 2024 rather than December 2023, with obviously to approve and adopt the new SCI, which obviously is important because it covers the local plan. It also covers development management as well. So what external meetings have happened to validate our approach? So we are keeping in close contact with the Department of Levelling Up, and we've taken two opportunities to have 2 meetings with them so far, and there will be further meetings in the future, where it was really helpful to discuss with them the key challenges that we're facing. They were extremely interested about nutrients and how they could help us, and obviously how can they help us bring forward the local plan. And they also have the Planning Advisory Service where they can offer support to us. And they were the ones that actually suggested that if we wanted a planning inspector advisory meeting, we could take them up on that offer. So moving to the local plan inspector advisory meeting, I must stress that this is not compulsory for local authorities to take. But the good news is that it's a free service that they offer. And what it is an inspector who's got a considerable experience in terms of obviously dealing with local plan examinations is available to discuss a number of matters that officers want to raise with them. So I'm going to go through those. So obviously we touched on the approach towards duty to cooperate. And we asked about obviously the changes to the government's. Obviously the government's been alluding to obviously a potential alignment policy. The inspector was very clear that we should obviously work towards obviously the duty to cooperate that as in law now, and basically focus on that. We talked about the plan period, And obviously the key changes to that is as I mentioned, the plan needs to when you adopt the plan, it needs to run for a minimum of 15 years. So we talked about obviously changing the plan period and the implications of that. We talked about the standard methodology in affordable housing. And the inspector's advice was very clear that we should set out our approach in terms of obviously how we've dealt with that in a separate topic paper. And that was their clear advice, was basically if you've done something, basically set it out in the topic paper. We talked about unmet housing needs, and again, the inspector thought that it was a good idea to set that out in the topic paper, including obviously how we're going to how the South Downs National Park is going to meet their requirement of the district housing requirement. We talked about phasing. Those of you who've read the Reg 18 local plan will know that we obviously tried to phase the greenfield sites to come forward at 2030 and the brownfield sites to come forward early. And it was just helpful to talk to the inspector about that. And obviously part of the reason is to try and smooth out the trajectory and the delivery of sites. So in other words, we don't have all the sites coming forward at the beginning part of the local plan. But again, the inspector's advice was we need to be very clear and obviously in terms of our approach and set that out in the topic paper. We talked about housing land supply, which obviously is a key issue for us in terms of obviously revising the LDS and obviously what the government guidance is about housing land supply and how you need to develop that. And obviously a key part of that is obviously what goes into the housing land supply in terms of commitments, allocations and windfalls and how you present that. We talked about the plan strategy and site selection. If you recall, we had housing targets that we asked various parish and town councils to meet in terms of obviously the Sheila sites. And obviously different parish and town councils approached it in different ways. And again, the inspector said it would be very good to set that out in the topic paper about how this went about. And that kind of leads us on to obviously the approach for site selection. We talked about the habitat regulations assessment, and obviously that's linked to obviously nutrients, which obviously was a separate subject we discussed. But obviously that is a really important test in terms of obviously how we dealt with the habitat regulations assessment. We talked about gypsies and travellers in terms of obviously the latest gypsy and traveller accommodation needs assessment and our site deliverability work that we've done to see if we can intensify any work. And the clear advice from the inspector was we should raise that issue with our neighbouring authorities, which we will do. We talked about neighbourhood plans in terms of obviously their allocations, particularly around whether or not we should phase the neighbourhood plan sites, i.e. we've got Denmead and we've got New Alsford. If they're greenfield sites, should they also align with obviously our phasing policy that we've got in the local plan to come forward basically no sooner than 2030. And we talked about carbon neutrality and low carbon infrastructure, particularly around the government's obviously expectations, what we can do, what we can't do. And we talked around obviously embedded carbon again in terms of what we thought we could do and can't do in terms of obviously the new local plan. So overall, it was really helpful to obviously have that kind of one-to-one discussion with the inspector and to seek obviously constructive feedback in terms of what we need to secure a local plan, a sound local plan. The feedback was very positive overall, but as I've mentioned, it did identify the need for topic papers to help explain the rationale and the approach the council has taken to certain issues. The production of topic papers will take obviously time, but this is time well spent because it will greatly assist the inspector at the local planning examination and those people obviously who wish to talk on the subject at the local planning examination, and hopefully it will cut down on the amount of examination time. So again, in terms of obviously reviewing the LDS, we took the advice from the department where they put us in contact with the Planning Advisory Service. Again, this was a free service that they provide. They offer peer support and help to local authorities. And again, it's good practice to involve PAS basically when you're producing a local development scheme. A company called DAC Planning was subsequently appointed by PAS to provide us officer support, and they undertook an independent review of the revised local plan timetable. And more importantly, we asked DAC Planning the challenging question, can the local plan be brought forward any quicker than what we've got in the revised timetable? And what are all the necessary steps that we need to complete to prepare a sound local plan? When we talked to DAC Planning, their feedback to us was we need to be very mindful, obviously, the resources that are needed in the strategic planning team to enable to produce a sound local plan. The review of the LDS was supported in order to allow sufficient time to complete all the necessary work. And given the complexity of the work and the different work streams and the kind of interdependencies of those work streams, it was suggested that we should have some additional project management support for the local plan. I'm pleased to say that the corporate services team have provided that support to us in the form of obviously more project management support. And that will obviously help myself and the rest of my team to be able to concentrate on local plan matters. But a key issue DAC Planning suggested was that we need to be very careful that we're not involved in non-local plan matters and keep very focused on matters, and obviously think very carefully about government consultations, which will come in obviously at a rapid rate, and perhaps only if we are going to give feedback, concentrate on the main issues. So in terms of Reg 19 local plan, the Reg 19 local plan needs to be agreed by full council, and this is the version of the plan that obviously needs to be examined. So in summary, the LDS has been revised to allow additional factors to take into account additional factors that have been described in this presentation, and some of which are completely out of our control. Nutrient neutrality still remains a key issue for us, a challenging issue, but obviously we've got a complex issue that obviously we've got both nitrates and phosphorus. Now clearly, obviously with nitrates, when that first happened, there was no solutions, and now there are nitrates trading platforms, but obviously with phosphorus, it's more complicated in terms of obviously how we deal with that. But we will get there, and there are solutions coming on stream to obviously tackle that. There is obviously a longer than expected time to take into account the strategic transport assessment, but that's obviously a critical piece of evidence. And obviously the Reg 18 local plan, we successfully engaged with a wide range of people, and we did receive obviously a highly technical responses to some of the consultation, and obviously some really good feedback that we want to take into account, building on that to obviously develop the Reg 19 local plan. The public consultation did identify new areas of work that we need to do, and obviously it will be essential that obviously we complete those before we move to the Reg 19 stage. And also it's obviously important that we have time to develop the topic papers and all the other suggestions that obviously came out of the PINS advisory meeting and the discussions with DAC Planning. So I'm not going through that slide again, but that kind of demonstrates the key work streams that my team's involved in, as well as obviously processing the representations. And it's important that obviously we do all of this alongside, because obviously we need to obviously complete those documents before we move safely to the Reg 19 stage. This is a copy of the revised timetable, which is in the local development scheme, which is in your papers. So what that is saying, obviously we've divided it by municipal years, and that's saying we're obviously moving towards the Reg 19 plan July, September time. So around about August, September time, we will be consulting on the Reg 19 local plan, and then moving towards obviously the local plan examination adoption. Now the adoption date is really important because at the recent event that I attended with the department, they said that basically, dates directly in front of me. Back to those dates. But the key thing is that we are working with the current system at the moment, and I'll come back to pick up on those dates, timings in a minute. But obviously we need to get obviously the plan adopted by the end of 2025. So we are extending obviously the timetable, which will mean that obviously we have to change the plan period from 2019 to 2020, and it will cover the period 2020 to 2040. We are moving the date of the Reg 19 local plan to August, September, and hold the local plan examination at the end of 2024, with a plan to adopt the plan at the end of 2025. Now, taking obviously a revised LDS has not been taken lightly. We've taken into account all the factors, but obviously we need to make sure that obviously all the evidence base is up to date. And importantly, obviously it relates to obviously a 5-year housing land supply. Now, at the moment, we're very fortunate that the major development areas such as Whiteley and Waterlooville are producing a number of houses, and they are a significant amount of our supply. And obviously they're not dealt with by phosphorus. They only have to deal with nitrates. They are large sites, so they can obviously deal with a lot of problems on site. If not, there are nitrates trading platforms available. So obviously it is a risk, but obviously we need to make sure that obviously we produce a sound local plan and complete all the evidence base that is necessary to move us towards examination. Our local plan will also be supported by the most up-to-date transport data, most up-to-date retail and employment data, and importantly, we've listened to what people have said in the public consultation, and we've taken that into account so we can produce a sound local plan. And that's really important. The message that I want to reiterate is that we have consulted with a wide range of people. They've given us some excellent feedback. We're taking that on board in terms of obviously how we can move forward. And I'll close there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to use this opportunity to say thank you for all the work you've done, not just on this paper, but you and your team have been doing in the last couple of years. So thank you. We're going to go now to public speaking. The first person is Councillor Carkeet. Would you like to come to the table, please? Thank you. Welcome. There's a little red button with a person's face you can see there on the right hand side.
Yep.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Kirkridge and Curbridge Parish Council, we'd like to object to the emerging policy NE7 settlement gaps. Whilst we support the principle of this policy, we object to the admission of the Whiteley-Curbridge-Botley gap. This is the only place where there's no defence against Solent City expanding north to coalesce with rural settlements. There is no evidence the local draft plan has evaluated the need for a settlement gap here and protects an important settlement from being encroached upon by adjacent developments. On page 118 of the draft plan, under the heading, What are we trying to achieve? The Council says settlement gaps are an important tool in identifying and protecting areas which could potentially be at risk of coalescence and helping settlements maintain their separate identities. Therefore, the absence of the formal settlement gap between Curbridge, Botley and Whiteley is inconsistent with the aspirations of the draft plan. Under the evidence-based policy NE7 of the emerging plan retains the settlement gaps from the 2017 local plan. There is no report to confirm the necessity of the retained gaps and no updated analysis of whether any additional settlement gaps might be justified given the additional development permitted since 2017. Curbridge is a substantial local settlement and scores 21 points in the City Council's settlement hierarchy review of 2021, the same as Hursley and a little behind Littleton. We're very concerned at the risk of creeping coalescence between Curbridge, Whiteley and Botley and do not believe this risk is adequately protected by relying on other policies in the plan. This risk can be mitigated by the inclusion of the settlement gap between Curbridge, Whiteley, Botley in policy NE7. And we believe such a gap would meet the PFSH criteria which has been adopted by the City Council. Therefore, request the Council amend the wording of the policy NE7 in the emerging local plan to include the identification of an additional settlement gap between Curbridge, Whiteley and Botley, and this settlement gap is identified on the appropriate maps. We also request that paragraph 310 of the introducing policy SP3 is amended to make unequivocally clear that large dispersed settlements such as Curbridge are also protected in full by SP3, and it includes reference to preventing coalescence. So in summary, we maintain that using the PFSH City Council criteria, there is sufficient justification for the designation of a formal settlement gap covering at least some of the land between Curbridge, Botley and Whiteley. There is a real and clear risk of coalescence taking place through speculative development permitted as extensions of the settlements of the Whiteley and Botley area. This risk arises from the scale of allocated and planned development in the area and the appetite of landowners to promote development opportunities, which has been demonstrated in the recent Sheila exercise. Coalescence between these settlements would have an urbanising effect on the undeveloped and open land in a sensitive landscaped area, and the City Council has stated clearly it wishes to avoid such an outcome. Policy SP3 on its own is not necessarily sufficiently robust, and the Council itself recognises this concern in that it considers NE7 necessary. Incorporating a settlement gap policy would not prevent development taking place. It is a protection, not a prohibition, and does not contradict national planning policy. The City Council has accepted the need for a settlement gap to be included between Wickham and Wellbourne, and the Parish Council at Curbridge sees no reason why it would be different for us. The City Council has undertaken no updated evaluation of the settlement gap policy or the need for new settlement gaps, and it cannot confidently state that designating the gap as requested by the Parish Council is either unnecessary or undeliverable. I'd ask you to consider that in the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Carr-Keating. You obviously wanted to get a lot into your 3 minutes, but it went at quite a pace. I tried to write down as much as I could. If you have that in writing, it'd be really helpful if you can send it in to Mr. Fox and then we can evaluate what you've said. So thank you very much, but thank you for taking the time to come and make the contribution. Thank you. Mr. Morse. Good morning again.
Some of us find it disturbing that an alleged climate emergency pervades and seems to underpin our local plan. The document dealing with the council's carbon neutrality roadmap states the villain of the piece as being atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions, etc. Few brief words about CO2. It is a trace gas currently making up 0.04% of our atmosphere. 96% of that is contributed by nature, not by man. It is at an extremely low level historically on the planet, which is not good news for the planet or for nature, by the way, since carbon dioxide is plant food in photosynthesis, and without it, not a single blade of grass would grow, nor would crops and foodstuffs, and not a single animal would live. There'd be no life on Earth. The climate has never been driven by CO2. On the contrary, CO2 levels in the atmosphere follow warming. They do not precede it or cause it. Your roadmap ignores all of this, and it's presumably the basis on which planning decisions will be made, as it does the science, that there is no, the scientific evidence that there is no catastrophic global warming, let alone caused by CO2 or fossil fuels. For your information, the hottest decade of the last 100 years was the 1930s. You can verify that for yourselves. Climate changes naturally all the time, and human activity is largely irrelevant. Normal human activity. On this showing, there's no justification for the economic and human cost that any push for carbon net zero will cause. And there are no realistic alternative technologies, by the way. Wind and solar cannot even remotely substitute for hydrocarbon fuels, oil and gas. That is impossible. The roadmap also flags the creation, flags up favourably the creation of 15-minute cities, low traffic neighbourhoods and other measures restricting movement. These are potential threats to the livelihoods, well-being and ultimately even fundamental human liberties of the population. I would suggest to the council that regardless of what government diktats, etc., may seem to impose upon them by way of the PINS requirements, etc., it is their duty not to follow this destructive delusion. It is their duty and their responsibility to do what is in our interest. Your responsibility is to us, not to the government, the authorities, the United Nations, the IPCC, or any dubious source of that kind. Your responsibilities as individuals, matter of conscience for all of you, is to us and to our human rights, liberties, and genuine well-being. Thank you very much, councillors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morse. I think there are two schools of thought, and you obviously share a different one from the one that the City Council's local plan holds at the current point. But thank you for your contribution. It's certainly worthwhile hearing. Thank you. I gather that the other speaker, Mr. Fleckley, doesn't want to speak this morning. So I think that's the end of our public speakers. Thank you very much. Questions to Mr. Fox for any clarification and to the rest of the planning team for any clarifications following the presentation. Do you have any questions, please? Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Councillor Porter. I had three questions, if possible. The first one is in regards to community engagement. So I was wondering if you could go sort of further into the community engagement. I know previously the council won an award for its community engagement throughout the COVID period. What specific sort of level of community involvement will there be moving forwards to and beyond the Reg 19 stage?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Williams. What we've done is consistently, we've looked at obviously the ways that we engage with people, particularly obviously starting with the SIP consultation. When we concluded that, and obviously we were successful in winning some awards for how we engage with people, we looked at that and reviewed it, and we basically challenged ourselves, how can we make it work even harder? And particularly obviously with the young people, we did a series of drop-in events at the universities and Sparshott College, to basically in Peter Symonds College, to make sure that obviously we were listening to young people. We looked at obviously the social media as well. How can we get out there better with the social media? So every time we do a consultation, we learn from what we did previously, and we would lose lessons to obviously how we can improve. And we're always challenging ourselves as team members to work even harder each time we do a public consultation. But rest assured, the Reg 19 consultation will have the same element and the same strands of community engagement that has worked and is proved to work in both the SIP consultation and the Reg 18 local plan. And we'll be doing the same exercise that we did basically at the Reg 19 stage. What can we do to work harder? And the key message also is that obviously the statement of community involvement also includes development management applications as well, about how we as a city council obviously need to consult with people on our obviously schemes, but importantly obviously how developers need to engage with members of the community as part of the development management process. And I think it's a really important document that sometimes is overlooked, and it's really important to put that document out for consultation. At the moment, like I say, that's heading towards the decision day, beginning part of October, and we strongly encourage everybody to participate and give us our feedback on our SCI so that we can make sure that we reach the maximum number of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Have you got another question? You said you had another question.
Yes.
So I'll take the second one and I'll go on and I'll come back.
Yeah, of course. There's been, I know Mr. Davis mentioned earlier about sort of government uncertainty in regards to sort of national planning policy. How has this affected the local plan process so far, and sort of how big is the risk to further delays to our local plans? Should there be further government policy uncertainty?
Thank you. Another really good question. I think the main thing is to obviously keep abreast of obviously what's happening. The key message that we're getting from government, and certainly the meeting that we attend with the department, was to carry on with the local plan. The key thing is that obviously we need to reach the local plan examinations, which we will do under the current LDS that is before you. The key message is that we need to get basically a local plan under the current system to examination by the 30th of June 2025, which obviously we will exceed that date. And the last date under the current system basically was the 30th, 30th of June. Yeah, the last date for local plans to be examined under the old system and adopted is the 31st of the 12th, 2026. So the government is very clear that local authorities, such as ourselves, should carry on with preparing our local plan under the current legislation. But obviously we are very mindful of obviously the changes that are out there. But obviously at the moment, loads of those are consultation documents. So it's very difficult to obviously nail it down specifically. But the main thing is to keep abreast of what's actually happening and make sure where possible we can future-proof the Reg 19 plan. Now, clearly, obviously, if something changes at the local plan examination, there is the opportunity. So, for example, the government's talked about national development management policies. We haven't got a time frame for when they're going to consult on those, what the extent of the scope of those is. But obviously, clearly, if they did come in during our examination and they were obviously something that local authorities had to abide by, as part of the main modifications, we can address that, because it might mean that obviously some of those duplicate policies that we've got, and we could say, well, we're taking out those policies because there's national policies. But at the moment, it's just keeping abreast of what's happening. There is a lot of change out there.
If I may add that for new members and members of the public, our local plan has to be compliant with national policies. So as those change, that means that our local plan and the implication on the local plan has also got to change. And one of the really interesting things that is sent out regularly by gov.uk is something from the chief planner, which comes out to all local authority people and to anybody else that wishes to sign up. And I've been signing up for that for quite some time. And only this week, I think it's indicative, it said planning guidance. This topic has now been archived. You will not get any more emails on this subject. So that's rather disappointing, because actually having that up-to-date knowledge is really important, because our team could end up going down the rabbit hole that they don't need to follow. They hopefully have a better relationship with DLUC and with the Planning Advisory Service than I do just going through gov.uk, but it does show the level of uncertainty that still exists. But I think it's been very clear that in all of our webinars that we've attended and the PINS inspector, that basically they say there is no change until it's a matter of law, and it has been changed. So we have to carry on at the rate at which we're doing at the moment. Councillor Horrell.
Thank you, Chair. And you said at the beginning this was the first of the new local plan committees, and can I thank you for reintroducing it? I think it's a great way for members of the public and members of the council to be involved in this important topic. A question really about resource. We did a great job getting responses from residents. In fact, you received awards for the process that you went through. But did we actually underestimate the work that Adrian's team would have to undertake? And I don't deny just how much they've been having to tackle. That we've had 3,500 responses, and we still haven't been able to get to all of those. And I think Adrian reaffirmed this morning that some of them are quite technical. Do we as a council need to, and perhaps that's a question to officers, really make sure that we've given the right resources to this important piece of work, so that the officers have the right support and indeed any additional resources? That's my first question, Chair, and it relates to the point that's already been made, the second one, which is about on page 59, the sort of changing nature of the environment in which we're developing this plan. Is it not the case that actually the world of planning is always changing? There's always something coming our way, and that it is a fluid world that we work in, and therefore to continue is, I believe, absolutely correct, even though some things are uncertain. But is it not always the case that some things are changing, or are there particular things over and above nitrates, which you've already highlighted as particularly difficult, that are substantially different this time versus previous plans that we have adopted? And is that why so many topic papers are being recommended, because of that level of uncertainty? Is there a link with that changing landscape and the topic papers? Thank you, Chair. Rather long question, but hopefully helpful for all of us to understand from Adrian.
It's a useful one. Mr. Fox, would you like to answer, and then if anybody else would like to add?
I will tackle the second question first of all, if that's okay, about the world of planning always changing. Yes, it is. Sometimes that makes the job exciting and interesting. But I think obviously at the moment there's been an unprecedented amount of consultations, and it's just literally trying to keep on top of those in terms of obviously what's coming our way, what implications are, and actually having the time to actually read them and digest. And then obviously waiting for the response to the consultations has taken some time, in terms of obviously particularly the changes to the planning system. I don't think we ever saw the government's response to that. So it is trying to obviously future-proof the plan. But obviously, I think it's also mindful that we can spend a lot of time obviously responding to consultations. Our professional bodies such as the RTPI, TCPA do respond to consultations. And obviously it's responding. I think the DHC planning hit the nail on the head in terms of basically if there's key points that we need to respond to. So for example, one key point that I'm particularly concerned with at an officer level in changes to the planning system is that obviously the government is proposing that you should produce a plan in 30 months. And I'm struggling to understand professionally how that can be done. So that may be a key issue that we go back to the government on responding, but obviously perhaps not spending time going through all the comments, because there are professional organisations that we can rely on. We'll be giving our voice back to the consultations, but it's just trying to keep abreast of exactly what is changing and what implications. Permitted development rights, for example, is mooted to change. So how can we deal with that in the local plan? And like I say, we can pick up some of these issues if something comes into law, as Councillor Porter indicated, at the time of local plan examination, we can deal with it through a main modification. So I think at the moment we just keep abreast of what's happening, mindful of it, try not to get too distracted with a lot of the kind of noise that's going on at the moment and things like that, and literally press on with the local plan.
Say something about resources, Chair. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Your question specifically, did we underestimate resources required? I can give you a confident no to that. We have resources available to us. We have a team of 7 people. They're not all full-time, but that's the number of people you're talking about that does the core work around this team here. And we also have considerable budgets for us to be able to access to bring in additional resources as and when required. So we track where our progress is, and Adrian and I discuss this regularly, and we consider whether we're going to bring in further resources to accelerate the piece of work, or whether we're going to keep that piece of work timed. We report those in our quarterly reports with budget and timings, and that's examined and scrutinised through performance panels. So I'm confident in saying we've had the right amount of resources for the work we've had this year. I will compliment my team, if I may, Chair, slightly cheekily in your cabinet meeting, for the volume of work they've done through the consultations that were added in.
Thank you. And I think we've agreed that the future consultations, we will tackle specific issues as Mr. Fox described, because they are the ones that really will affect, going back to the point Mr. Morse, but they're the ones that will affect our district. And that's important for us. Thank you.
The question on the topic papers, does that?
Yes.
I think the key thing to mention about topic papers is what was really helpful with the plan inspectorate was a lot of these things, obviously my team are very much kind of involved in them, and you think kind of, well, how does an independent person approach this? And that was quite a really good challenge to us in terms of basically we've produced this and we said, oh, we've done this, and it said, well, where's that written down? And I think that's the advantage of topic papers. I've used them in previous local authorities, but I think again, due to the complexity of the way the system is, I think the need for topic papers has increased since I last did a local plan. I've been through 3 successful local plan examinations before, so I think the need for them has increased because it is getting more complicated. And it's good practice to write down what you did and how you did it, and then therefore it's open not only to the inspector but obviously to anybody else about the approach that you've taken. And for example, if I use the obviously the methods of engagement that town and parish councils took towards obviously engaging with the local community, we had some people that mal-dropped the whole community and asked for comments. Some people had public meetings and things like that. And the inspector's advice was, well, let's just document that about what people actually did. And that's good practice. It's good to be transparent about the approach that's been taken. And like I said, we've got people like Push that we can rely on to produce a topic paper on nutrients. They're much more versed in that subject than I am. So we can pull on other people to produce the topic papers. And just to reiterate, obviously, that we are pulling on, obviously, over and above the resources that Mercedes mentioned, and pulling on every team pretty much in the council in terms of obviously helping us out with the reps, saying to them, well, we've got a rep on this, asking the NERT team, we've got a rep on the landscape thing, what's your thoughts on this? So we are engaging the whole council in this debate about obviously how the reps have obviously raised issues and whether or not obviously we need to amend the plan.
Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor, I'm going to go to Councillor Thompson first, then Councillor Westwood, then to you. Okay. Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think this is a question for Mr. Ayling. We talk about the 5-year land supply that we need to always have to conform to our local plan. And I just wonder whether he could make some comments on when we talk about the 5-year land supply, we often refer to the housing, the need for housing and housing numbers within that. And I just wonder whether Mr. Ayling could comment on the need for employment land as well, and perhaps reassure us that we do still have a 5-year land supply for employment land too, because obviously that's an important part within our local plan going forward. Thank you.
If I may, the planning system has slightly different requirements with regards to local authorities and employment land as housing land. So there is not quite the same specific requirement for 5 complete years of supply in the same way as there is for housing. With employment land, however, it is part of the plan process to assess and make sure that we are understanding and ensuring there is space for businesses to grow and move to the area. And that is part of the process that's been undertaken by the current employment and town centres review, which is underway, and Adrian's outlined to you. What I would say at the moment, however, is we still have a number of sites allocated in adopted plans that are available for employment development now, including land at Whiteley and Bushwick Camp in the largest sites, but also areas such as in Newellsford and Bishop's Waltham. So there is land here now. The part of this iteration, the purpose of this iteration of the plan is to understand if that is the right balance of employment land or whether we've got enough going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Ayling. And I think that Councillor Westwood's question, he's indicating to me that it might relate to this, but it's relating back to the housing.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Well, the question, Mr. Fox, I think is coming in your direction. So in your presentation, you talked about obviously we're proposing to move the date 2019 to 2020. In your presentation, you said that there was sufficient land supply for housing for 5 years, if I focus specifically on that as opposed to business. Could you just enlarge on how that 5-year land supply is secured within the change of date? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Westwood. So each year we produce what's called an authority monitoring report, and the monitoring report covers the period from the kind of preceding year, it's kind of municipal years. We publish that authority monitoring report in December each year. Included in that AMR is our 5-year housing land supply calculation. And what that does is that looks at obviously allocations, completions and windfalls during obviously that year. So basically from 31st of March to the 1st of April the following year. Now at the moment we've got a healthy supply because we have got the major development areas obviously delivering a significant number of homes. And our kind of housing completions have been obviously over and above what the government's obviously target is. So for example, in 2020, 2021, we had 874 completions. 2021 to 22, we had 1,201 completions. This year we're looking, we haven't yet finalised the figures, but it could be around 1,000 completions. So we've got a healthy supply of obviously completions coming through the system. Now, the 5-year housing land supply is really important, and obviously the plan period is really important. So by moving the plan period forward to 2020 instead of 2019, we would lose around about 500 dwellings off the supply, but we can still count the windfall contribution that we've calculated in our windfall study. So we still feel confident that we can defend a 5-year housing land supply. Certainly under the current system, I don't know whether or not there'll be any changes at all to the 5-year housing land supply in terms of obviously how that's calculated. But the good news is obviously we've got the large site delivering obviously large numbers of houses at the moment. So at the moment we feel as confident as we can be, subject to any changes to how we calculate that housing land supply figure. But yes, it is a risk, but obviously we think it's a manageable risk.
Any questions to follow that, Councillor Westwood? Okay, thank you. Councillor Lee, and then I'll come back to Councillor Williams and then Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Picking up on the comment I think Adrian made about future-proofing the plan, which I think we all agree with, and linking that to the Paris 6.2 environmental considerations, i.e. the climate emergency is a defining issue for the local plan, which I entirely endorse. Can I ask how is the council going to be treating the recent spatial planning for climate resilience and net zero report, which I appreciate has only come out recently? Not wishing to add to the workload, which I recognise is high. Is there an opportunity, you talk about consultancy support at para 7.2, to get the right consultancy skill set to take a look at that? Because there are a number of barriers and opportunities which I think deserve consideration to future-proof the local plan. So I wonder what the thinking is in terms of that, please.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. It's a very good document. I've only just started dipping into it myself in terms of obviously what its recommendations are. Now, the key thing is obviously what a local plan can actually do. And that's a real challenge for us in terms of obviously, there's particularly obviously with the energy statements, there's been various inconsistent appeal decisions and regarding basically the different way that local plans have adopted that, which is what we discussed with the inspector. In terms of a written ministerial statement and the approach that obviously local councils can take. With, for example, embedded carbon, again, what can a local plan actually do? Again, obviously, there's been different mixed messages out there. I am keen, it's one area that I am very passionate about in terms of obviously carbon neutrality, about pushing the local plan as far as I can go, but safely as I can go. And clearly, it's going to change. The world is changing in terms of obviously the knowledge and what's happening with the building regs, etc. And I think it's basically how far can we safely go in this local plan and what can we do in the next local plan? Because it won't be the end of the story. It's very much the beginning that we are trying to basically push forward the agenda on the climate emergency as far as we can, as safely as we can. But obviously, like I say, we need to obviously take into account best practice and more importantly, what the government is going to allow us to actually do to obviously have a sound local plan. So it's an area that I'm really passionate about, and that's why we've got a topic on that particular area. So yes, I'm reading it, we're trying to digest it. We've got a good team of consultants in Trover that are obviously looking at the energy performance policy at the moment. They're advising us on the embedded carbon. So I've got access to people, but obviously what I want to basically make sure is that we focus where we can get wins.
If I may add, I think that's where the frustration of the national guidance that our local plan has to comply, unless we can make it very clear, a very good reason why we're not, and that's the topic papers are included in that conversation. And in our first call for sites, we asked for green sites. I don't think any green sites came forward in that.
We did have some sites, but unfortunately they did not have landowner permission. So they were kind of aspirational ideas rather than landowner permission, and that's quite challenging in terms of obviously what we can do with it. But we were one of the first authorities to do a call for green sites. Like I say, the main thing is we obviously need landowner consent.
And there's the challenge.
Just a very quick supplementary. So South Downs National Park called for sites, which included sites for renewable energy. Could you just comment on what Winchester has achieved in that sense, please?
Been working very closely with Anna and Steve in the climate emergency team. They've taken on a Sheila layer, if I can call it that, of all the sites that have been put forward by landowners, site promoters, and they're looking at obviously the renewable potential of those sites because clearly landowner obviously willingness is obviously a key part of obviously its own deliverability. Anna is obviously leading on some piece of work too on obviously rooftop potential solar. So we're working closely with her in terms of obviously what that's doing. But obviously we thought the Sheila layer was a good layer for them to have because it did show that obviously there was landowner at least kind of they were willing to do something. Obviously they put it forward for housing or employment, but obviously it's not suitable for that. Could it be potentially suitable for renewable energy, but obviously where is it in relation to obviously the connection to the grid, etc., and things like that. So Anna's doing some really good work on that at the moment.
Can I ask about the statements of common ground, because I understand that's also with utilities, as we're aiming to have those with utilities as well, or some utilities.
Sorry, Councillor Porter, could you repeat?
About statements of common ground, will we be having those with some of the utilities as well?
Yes, we will do. So people like Southern Water, the Environment Agency, Historic England, National Highways, they're all on the list of people to basically we would have a statement of common ground with. And some of them will need joint signatories, some will be individual authorities. But let's say at the moment we just scoped out who we think we need statement of common grounds with, and that work will be progressing in September, October to have those initial meetings with them in terms of obviously the scope and content of those statement of common grounds. And it's kind of an iterative process. They will change and some will change up until the examination. But the main thing is let's have those discussions now to basically kind of identify what issues we need to talk about.
Councillor Williams and then Councillor Reid.
Excellent. Part of my question was actually answered already by Councillor Westwood's question. It was in relation to the Whiteley and West Waterlooville completion numbers and whether they would cover the 643 dwellings from the 2019, but also whether the housing buffer would be sufficient to maintain the 5-year housing supply should there be any further delays to the local plan.
Thank you. So yes, the Whiteley and Waterlooville figures are obviously included in our 5-year housing land supply calculations. They didn't really kind of start coming into kind of developing until about 2019, 2020. And between them, they're pushing around about 600 dwellings between them. Mainly the benefit of Whiteley is that this developer called Consortium, which obviously is great because obviously you can get not only different products to obviously sell to people, but obviously greater housing completions. In terms of the actual housing buffer in the Reg 18 local plan, we had obviously a figure of 1,450, which was to address obviously any changes to standard methodology and any push unmet housing need. There is no clear guidance from government in terms of what that buffer should be. We did raise that with the inspector at the advisory visit. Her approach was that it was a sensible approach to have a buffer because clearly some sites may come out of the local plan. Some work needs to obviously happen as a result of the site deliverability statements in terms of obviously when we're asking landowners, developers about obviously their sites. So it's a sensible approach that she endorsed, but she couldn't comment on obviously the extent of it, whether or not, in other words, it should be bigger or smaller. But that's obviously clearly something that we need to take into consideration when we're looking at the site deliverability forms, the reps, and obviously what kind of buffer we think is appropriate.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a number of things, if I may. I must apologise, my hearing is not what it's supposed to be. Looking at the land usage that has been published thus far in Reg 18, obviously there is one major factor for many areas within the district, and that of gypsies and travellers, which has still not been revealed. This we know will cause some concerns to local residents, wherever those sites may be, in boroughs or elsewhere. So I'm rather concerned that this element has been left quite late. The additional numbers to the MDA, which has just been spoken about, how will this affect the master plans which have already been agreed by this council and in the case of West Waterlooville by 2 district councils? Will this have an adverse effect? Something I'd like to know a little bit more about. Changing the end date of the plan, can there be a legal challenge from anyone on that element? And finally, we spoke of windfall sites, and this is something that is obviously fairly dear to my heart because windfall sites are, as it quite says, additional numbers that come into the game. Are these numbers can be taken into account? But I trust
that it will be done in a way that we are not going to renege on them some years down the road. Which is what is actually happening at the moment.
Councillor Reid, I understand what you're probably alluding to, but I'm going to leave those questions to Mr. Fox. So the first one was about gypsy and travellers. Second one was about the numbers in the MDA, how will they affect the master plan of Western Waterloo Bill, the relevance of changing end date of the plan, and the conversation about windfall sites.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. In terms of gypsy and travellers, you'll be aware that we've completed a gypsy and traveller accommodation needs assessment, and obviously we've done some work looking at obviously which sites could potentially be expanded to accommodate some more needs. We also did a call for sites for gypsy and traveller sites, but regrettably, obviously, I think we had one site come forward, and that was it. It is a challenging issue, particularly in the southern part of the district. I appreciate that. Some local authorities, we discussed this with the inspector, have obviously included a provision for gypsy and travellers within their allocated sites. Now, obviously, our largest allocated site is the John Moore Barracks, but obviously most of the need is in the southern parishes. The inspector's suggestion was that we should basically make sure that we engage with our neighbours regarding the gypsy and traveller need, and that's what we're intending to do, in terms of obviously whether or not that need could be accommodated elsewhere, because clearly at the moment we're struggling to find sites that are suitable for gypsy and travellers. So it is a key issue that we are alive to, and obviously the change with the recent case law regarding the definition of gypsy and travellers obviously has implications as well. And obviously we need to unpick kind of those numbers to make sure that those people that are basically in that accommodation needs assessment are actually gypsies and travellers, because there are regrettably some people that are not gypsy and travellers and are using caravans for obviously cheaper housing. So we need to unpick that to kind of figure a lot more. So that is a key work stream that we need to look at. In terms of obviously the additional numbers in terms of the master plans, I think you're alluding to the fact that obviously we've got a master plan agreed for obviously those large sites, and the Reg 18 local plan includes obviously some additional land. Developers obviously that are obviously promoting those have been contacted, and obviously we need to think about obviously how they integrate with those master plans. But obviously no doubt they commented at the Reg 18 stage in terms of obviously how they're going to do that. In terms of obviously a challenge to the end date of the local plan, well, you know, somebody could challenge it. The main thing is we're trying to de-risk it by saying basically that we're not going to adopt the local plan until this period, obviously 2025. So therefore 15 years, 2040. So we're trying to be obviously counter that in terms of obviously the end date of the local plan. In terms of windfall sites, clearly obviously within each settlement in the Reg 18 local plan, there was obviously an allowance for windfall in the various settlements. And obviously the windfall allowance is documented in a separate windfall paper, but obviously that is separate to the allocations because we need both in terms of obviously meeting the housing requirements that are set out by government.
Can I just come back on my?
Yes, and
and
then
say
I'd like to make a
what I
comment.
should have started off by saying thank you, Adrian, to you and your team for the work that you are doing. Planning is a situation where the guidelines are moving left, right and centre, and have been for many years. This is the fourth local plan that I've been associated with, and it is probably the most interesting one in the sense that we have a lot of secret squirrels around. It's not as open as it used to be to talk about, but I look forward to discussing it in full council eventually.
Thank you. I'd just also like to say that this plan differs from the last in the sense that we were always very conscious of windfall sites and how many houses that contributed to the housing right across the whole district. And so Adrian did a very good job, Mr. Fox did a very good job of writing a paper to justify including windfalls in our figures, which we hadn't done before. But they are relevant. Those windfalls are relevant for the years of the plan. I think that's important to remember. And the second point I was going to make is that I think there's a stronger possibility of a challenge if we don't do the work that's being asked for and we've already identified. The principle of moving the date is because we know that that work needs to be done in the light of all these different challenges that we've had in terms of planning. It's really important when we've looked at the alternatives and the options considered, actually just going ahead and putting that application in as a Reg 19 was completely discounted because it would not be an appropriate thing to do. It is much better to have the absolutely solid evidence to go forward before making an application for a Reg 19 plan. So I just want to say that.
Chair, thank you. As you are aware, and I know Adrian was aware, when the timeline was first announced, I think I was the only one that voiced a concern at the tightness of that timeline. Sadly, it looks like, in a sense, I was right.
And I noticed the County Council's Reg 18 plan for minerals and waste is also delayed in the same way. So I think it's we are not alone, but many councils have chosen to delay their and postpone and stop their work. And we cannot do that. We do need this for the certainty of our residents and of our sites. So thank you for your comment. Councillor Lamey.
Thank you, Chair. Several questions. The transport assessment, does that take into account the influence of LTP4 and the Winchester Movement Strategy? I noticed from this paper that the old model has been for predicting traffic is in. The second point is in view of public transport and the new developments that we may have, do we have any influence on the bus routes? Because we have certain areas in Winchester at the moment that don't have bus services. And we need to influence that some way in the local plan, if that's possible. And also, as an extra question, we notice that there's redundancies coming at Hampshire County Council. How will that affect us, and have we taken any plans to counteract any slippage on that sort of thing? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Amy. I think that's a key reason why we wanted to appoint Hampshire Council Trading Arm, is to make sure that obviously we take into account LTP4, Local Transport Plan 4. They're obviously a key partner with us in terms of the Winchester Movement Strategy and also the LC Whip. So all of those things will be fully taken into account. And what we were particularly impressed with Hampshire Trading Arm was that they didn't want to basically go down the traditional route in terms of basically predict and provide. In other words, basically, say, for example, expanding a roundabout with another arm or another junction, etc. They really wanted to prioritise basically sustainable transport, which is very much in line with obviously the council's priorities. And obviously that's a key part of obviously the work that they will be doing. In terms of obviously bus routes and things like that, that's a little bit beyond the scope of the local plan. I know a number of people have written to us in the reps about bus routes declining, Stagecoach obviously withdrawing services, but unfortunately that's well beyond the remit of my local plan in terms of what I can do and can't do. So regrettably, that's down to discussions obviously with Stagecoach. But obviously it does come back to the same issue with obviously retail, where obviously if you are planning obviously new development, it does become more viable when obviously you've got more communities in that area, just the same way that retail, obviously a retail site promoter is going to look at a town or city if they're planning growth and obviously expansion. And in terms of obviously the Hampshire County Council redundancies, unfortunately, I don't have any details of that. It's obviously very regrettable news from colleagues at Hampshire, but obviously it's Hampshire County Council trading arm that we're dealing with and not the statutory arm. So obviously there is a distinction there. But as far as I know, everybody we're dealing with the Hampshire County Council trading arm is still in place and still working.
And coming back to that point about the bus routes, of course, it is being done with the Winchester Movement Strategy, and part of that strategy is to try to define bus routes in a better way long term.
I mean, it is quite a problem for quite a few communities.
I agree. Councillor Reid, another question.
Sorry, Chair. Your Place, Your Plan, Winchester District Authorities Monitoring Report, last published on the 31st of March, or up to the 31st of March 22. Will the new copy be available in a very short space of time? Because obviously what has happened over the last 2 or 3 years will have an adverse effect, or an effect definitely on this particular monitoring. It refers to a lot of things that are now a little bit suspect. We might consider a little bit suspect. So basically, when is it next going to be published? Because it does fall in line with this local plan.
I receive the updates on a regular basis. Mrs. A, did you want to comment, or Mr. Fox?
Thank you. The AMR is always published in December time. The AMR covers a wide range of issues such as housing, employment, land, plus a number of obviously monitoring indicators. Some of that monitoring data is not available till kind of late autumn time, so that's why it's published in December. So it will be published again in December, and obviously it covers the period, as I mentioned, obviously 31st of March to the 1st of April. The housing completion data, we've just got an early draft of that, but like I say, that's still saying that we're in an extremely healthy position in terms of obviously the completions of that housing completions. So like I say, it is published every December, regular as clockwork, available on the website, and that is the most up-to-date thing we can do, because obviously, like I say, some of the monitoring data is not available till late autumn, so we obviously want to publish it all at once. But it is taken into account, it's undertaken by my team. So any information from that, what it's telling us in terms of trends or whatever, are taken into account.
That's Laurel.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just seek some clarification, please? The report talks about the buffer housing numbers that you've already mentioned, Adrian, the 1450. We're in the hands of obviously the South Downs National Park for, I believe, the 500 homes that we estimated. They're obviously on a different timescale from us, but what level of certainty do we have on their ability to deliver those numbers for us, and will the 1450 be used to cover any variance from South Downs? And also at the push meeting in July, which I think Councillor Todd attended, there was comment at that meeting that Winchester was one of the authorities that was perceived to be able to meet its MPPF housing needs targets, and that potentially through our process we could deliver some contribution to unmet need for push. Where are we in understanding the push numbers? And I know there's been huge debate about what the unmet need is in that area, and how will we manage that within the buffer numbers that we have to ensure better certainty for our plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. In terms of obviously the 500 figure that we are relying on in terms of the South Downs National Park, because obviously it is a district-wide figure. We've been in correspondence with officers, and we have regular communication with our counterparts over at the South Downs National Park. It is important to stress that within that 500, there's 219 actually committed already. So basically there's 280 on top of that. The previous statement of common ground that we had with the park in 2018, I believe, had around 600 dwellings over the 20-year period. So we're around about right, we think, what can be delivered. Appreciating that obviously the South Downs National Park are on a different timescale to us. Now that figure would be confirmed in our statement of common ground with them, with the park, and obviously those discussions are going to happen fairly shortly. So like I say, we've got email correspondence from them and discussions with them. So what we will be doing is obviously putting that into obviously the statement of common ground discussions with them. In terms of obviously the push unmet housing need, again, they're part of our discussions, which we need to have, particularly with Portsmouth and Havant. We've got a meeting planned with Portsmouth later on in September. The main thing is obviously at the moment, none of those local authorities have actually identified what their unmet need is. So it's very challenging, and we discussed this with the inspector. How do you plan for a figure that you don't actually know what it is? Now, clearly, obviously, we can meet our standard methodology figure, as is our understanding that Test Valley and Basingstoke can also meet their housing figure. And obviously, at the moment, the buffer's in there, but the buffer needs to be reviewed in light of the representations, in light of obviously our site deliverability statements to see what is an appropriate buffer and obviously what is an appropriate figure. And like I said, there's no kind of cast iron answer to that in terms of it should be this or that. It is a judgment call in terms of what we can put forward. Obviously, at the time of the Reg 18 local plan, we were talking about a figure of 1,450, which we as officers thought was a reasonable figure. So obviously, we'll just keep that under review. I understand that the statement of common ground is going next to the next joint committee, I believe, in September. And obviously, we're working on a spatial position statement. But obviously, we are having individual conversations with those authorities. But it's very difficult when obviously we don't actually know what their unmet need is. So that's as much as I can say at the moment, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
I know that Councillor Cutler has been involved in this. Do you want to say anything more, or do you think that Mr. Fox has covered it all?
Councillor Todd attended the last joint committee, but I spoke to him about it. I've looked at the minutes, and the statement of common ground was deferred from that paper. I think Push is suffering from the same problems as we are in terms of government continually appearing to move the goalposts. You know, this strategy of floating ideas, consulting, and then never actually taking any decisions, which is causing such huge confusion in planning across across the country. So it's very, as Mr. Fox pointed out, it's very, very difficult to make progress on the statement of common ground, and certainly the idea of a joint strategy, an agreed joint strategy across Push, I think is a long way off at the moment.
So therefore, it's really important for us to have our own duty to cooperate the statements of common grounds with each authority that surrounds us in the normal way.
I mean, a statement of common ground is not necessarily, an agreement to take numbers, is it? So I think the statement of common ground may move on, and it may be possible, which will save us doing the individual ones. But a sort of joint strategy and agreement on numbers is going to be a lot more difficult. I mean, we have to remember that the duty to cooperate is a duty to cooperate. It's not a duty to agree, and we must always remember that.
I think we're living through that through various INSIP processes as well. It's actually a statement of what you do agree on, but also a statement of what you don't agree on. Very much so. Thank you.
Councillor Porter, can I just ask that you made a very good point there then, given the difficulty of a sort of central agreement through Push, is our sort of position that we should have those individual conversations with surrounding authorities, because at least we can clearly demonstrate then that we've had that conversation on an individual basis, even if there isn't a collective view for the broader region.
That's my understanding, but I'll just get Mr. Foxall to confirm that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and obviously the statement of common ground can address other issues. So, for example, with Eastleigh, we've got some nitrate credits in their area where they've said that obviously we can be accessible to obviously development in Winchester. So again, the statement of common ground can cover issues like that. So I think there's a lot wider issues. We get very focused on housing, but there's a lot of other issues that the statement of common grounds can do. So like I say, we've got a list of authorities, we've got an initial list of ideas about what could be in the statement of common ground, and those discussions will be commencing in September time with those authorities. But I think it's the safest approach that we can have.
Thank you.
Thank you to Councillor Cutler as well. And just to say, even in the press in the last 2 or 3 weeks, on the 23rd of July, there was a piece in the press, in the Times actually, saying that the Prime Minister was considering abandoning the phosphate issue. And then even yesterday, the House Builders Federation were stating that actually why should they be picking up the bill for the agriculture. So we know that so many of these things are up in the air at the moment that nobody quite knows what that's about. Councillor Lee.
You're clearly reading my mind. I was going to ask the question about this Winchester wastewater treatment upgrade. How many houses are dependent on that upgrade? And what's the contingent plan if that upgrade doesn't happen because funding is not made available?
Thank you. That's a project we're still working through, so I can't give you numbers today. But we're optimistic it will provide some provision for us and for houses that are not just in our own remit. But the project is in very early stages, so I'm not able to, I don't have the information to give you today. But we continue to work very closely with PUSH, who are leading on solutions for us. We have bids in with the Department of Housing and Local Levelling Up, sorry, I've got that the wrong way around, for a couple of potential projects, and we're keeping all of our doors open so we can find the solution as quickly as possible.
But we also think it's the right thing to do.
No, I agree, but it could pose some major problems down the line if this doesn't come to fruition. Yeah, okay, early days.
I think it is the right thing to do. Thank you. No? Okay, on to debate then. Does anybody want to make the first move on the debate? Councillor Thompson. I'll pick Councillor Thompson first, so I'll come to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just really a few comments. I think we've had a really good discussion this morning regarding our local plan and the development of it. And I think we've been really clear that we've heard today that there is absolutely no risk to our 5-year land supply, both in terms of housing numbers and land for employment. And I believe that certainly doesn't leave us in a dangerous position, which some have suggested. I think we've also heard that the government is really in free fall at the moment, and they have been for a number of months now. To my knowledge, there have been 6 government consultations around planning. None of the results have been available on those. So nobody really knows where those consultations stand and whether there's going to be any alterations to the planning rules that we are all sort of abiding by now. I think it's also really clear to point out that we want to make sure that when we do present the Reg 19, that we are going forward with a really sound local plan. We have that really backed up by good knowledge and good what's the word, advice. And of course we did take the advice of the planning advisory pins that said we need to produce a number of other subject topic papers. And having taken that advice, I think it would have been absolutely foolish on us if we then said we weren't going to go forward with that. So yes, we want to ensure that our local plan is sound going forward. We also want to ensure that it is future-proofed, and that's why we are going above and beyond in terms of looking after our environment in the standards that we are suggesting for our local plan. And we want to get this local plan adopted as soon as possible, because then we can start adopting those increased environmental standards that we all want to see. So I'm really happy to support the recommendations before us. I think it's been an incredibly difficult time for the officers, having to try and muddle through with all these various announcements coming out from government that clearly don't know what they're talking about from one day to another. And I think the best thing we can do is we have to have a published plan for when we want our local plan to be adopted by. And that's what we're doing today. And I'm really happy to support the recommendations before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. Many points have already been raised, obviously, by Councillor Thompson. No, that's right. But I just wanted to sort of, further sort of reassure, many other neighbouring authorities have cancelled their local plans, as mentioned earlier in the questioning stage. I think it's right that we take the time to listen. All our residents have put forward to these responses, and that we take the time to fully read through and consider their suggestions. I'm also reassured in regards to the 5-year housing supply and the responses from Mr. Fox in regards to that. So I support the Cabinet members and officers in their revised timetable as proposed.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Lamy.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to reiterate, I think, what Councillor Thompson said. I think we've taken into account the current situation, and we're planning and going ahead with that plan, which is essential, even though the government is in free fall, because it gives us some safeguards for the future, which we really desperately need. So I'm very happy with the way it's going at the moment.
Thank you. I'd just like to say something. I think that the local development scheme is there on the table at page 27, but actually it also does then include a set of risks that we're very aware of, and I think it's really important that we keep in mind those risks so that we can address those as we go on. But then it also gives us a very clear, on Appendix B, a local plan programme, which we still do want to stick to. And that's really important, of having that very clearly out there for the members of the public to understand, and developers, as well as local councils and parish councils and ourselves. And I think it probably describes it more clearly now, the process through which we have to go. I'm really pleased that the local plans, the scheme, or the development plan scheme, explains the issues that we've got, and explains those to the general public really clearly as well, but also then describes the process to the end, which is still well in advance of the deadline that's been set now by government for this current round of local plans. So I think I'm very happy to support this. Does anybody else want to comment? Councillor Horrell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for a really helpful discussion this morning, and to the officers for answering so many questions. I think it's been, the committee has sort of fulfilled its role this morning, and thank you to Adrian for your presentation. A double act from last week as well to members, and it's been really helpful to clarify all of that. And I'm reassured in the Cabinet paper before you today that the local plan is detailed as one of the city's council's biggest corporate priorities. It clearly is, and there's a lot of interest in that. And I hope, Adrian, we can keep the excitement of the officers that you mentioned earlier in a time where things are clearly moving. And I appreciate the LDS is absolutely a key requirement, so we have to have it, and it has to be there, as you say. So day one, it's not an option. However, I suppose the one thing I would ask in all of this, and this is to the strategic director team, is, the resources you assured us are appropriate, but that we do give our very best support in all of these elements that are clearly changing to that team. The to-do list is clearly extensive, and my question, I suppose, is could we shorten the timeline for everything by adding more resource in whatever way might be appropriate? And also, Councillor Porter, you mentioned it, but also to maintain a very robust risk register on this plan, so that we understand if something does change or we learn something new, that we obviously articulate those risks really clearly and what we might be able to do to mitigate against those. I'm sure we will all be meeting in due course to continue the conversation on this absolutely critical piece of work for the District Council. Thank you.
I'd love to say that we could shorten some of the timelines, but in many cases they're specialist reports that have been written by specialist teams, and we've got deadlines that we've set and we're challenging them, but they are where they are. But Mr. Fox might like to comment on that. Oh, actually, I'm not allowed to ask Mr. Fox to comment on that. Sorry, I'm going to answer that one. Councillor Westwood.
Thank you, Chair. We've lived through some fairly turbulent times over the last 5 years, and I have utmost sympathy with Mr. Fox and his team in the changes that have been made during that period. And we've talked around changes in terms of the requirements for nutrients, which came in quite suddenly 18 months ago, and obviously it's disrupting the process. But also the transport assessments, the way people move around now, and the actual commuting that people do is very, very different. So when we look at the local plan and the requirements within it, and each comment that we've had back, there's a real huge amount of work to assess the impact and obviously rework of some of the information and data and systems that we've had in place previously. I think one of our other issues has been the sheer success of the consultation process. And we've had significant numbers of people and organisations commenting and providing information, and I think that's a good thing. And you know, it's a clear requirement of this process that we consult widely and clearly and take on board the comments of people and translate those back into the impact of the proposed and emerging local plan on the environment going forwards and the district going forwards. I agree with my colleague Councillor Thompson in terms of the 5-year land supply, and clearly moving the dates has an impact on that, and I'm happy that Mr. Fox and his team have a clear understanding and handle on the impact on moving that date. I think the proposed work going forwards, I listened to Councillor Horrell, and yes, resources are an issue, absolutely, and they do appear in the risk register, and your point about the risk register is also vital, that risk register is maintained going forwards and will be. I also think setting up this committee and the other forums, the members forums that we've said with the consultation and feedback through our members, and having an open process is really a good way of taking this forward as well. So in summary, I understand the reasons why we've had to make a change to the LDS, and I fully support the proposals as in the document going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are to the recommendations, and actually I'm just going to change something very slightly. It says revised Winchester District Local Development Scheme August 23. I set out in Appendix 2 in this report, be approved and brought into immediate effect, and it should have said and including Appendix A and B. So it's from page 27 to 40, including Appendix A and B, which are noted in the report. And then, so therefore 3 is now 2, and that authority is delegated to the Strategic Planning Manager in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Place and Local Plan to undertake minor updating and drafting of any amendments required prior to publication. So I'm recommending, and I'm very happy to agree, that the revised District Local Development Scheme August 2023 is approved and brought into immediate effect. Can I ask my 2 other voting members?
Agreed.
Agreed. So therefore that recommendation is agreed. Thank you very much indeed for coming today. This is the end of the recording.